Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome, because we have a host of scholars from the French, German, and Anglophone academic worlds to this book launch for Miriam Hunter-Henin's Why Religious Freedom Matters for Democracy, Comparative Reflections from Britain and France for a Democratic Vivre Ensemble. I'm delighted to have you all here. There's two administrative things I'd like you to know. One is that this is being recorded for upload on the UCL Laws YouTube channel. So if you don't want to appear, please, you have to turn off your camera. And the second is to invite everybody who wants to join us on the Wonder platform which is a kind of social platform where people can chat in groups after the event. It was included in your final email, and the link to join this platform will also be put in the chat. Writing books is a lonely business, particularly in the last year and a half, sitting in your room thinking this section needs to go there, but has to be before that, and moving it around and wondering if it's any good. And so I'm delighted that we're here socially, albeit distantly, to discuss Miriam's book, which, spoiler alert, is very good. But it's a really thoughtful, wonderful contribution to ongoing debates. And we'll have two panels. And I'll go straight now to Miriam, who will give a brief synopsis of her book before we move back to the first panel, back to me that I'm chairing, and I'll introduce the speakers for that panel then. So over to you, the star of the moment, Miriam.
Thank you, Ronan. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I am really pleased to be here today on this shared virtual space to present and discuss my recent book published with Hart. But before I give you a brief insight into the book as announced by Ronan, let me thank Kat Balogun, who hides behind the scene, but who is the one we need to thank. Thanks to her, we are all appearing on screen at the same time, whatever that time might be actually in our respective places. I am, of course, also very grateful to the speakers for taking part today on this very hot day. We'll see whether the panelists agree with the conclusions in my book, but they have each deeply inspired my thinking on the topic. And I am therefore indebted to them, not only for engaging with my ideas today, but also for contributing and shaping them through their own writing. And of course, as I can see many delegates in the gallery view right now, the same applies to many of the attendees. Many of the attendees today have supported me through their own publication and often their support. So thank you. So what, in a nutshell, is the book about? There are three threads in the book: comparative, conceptual, and legal. Via different manifestations suited to each national context, I argue that in both England and France, religious freedom can be construed in ways amenable to pluralism and deepening of democracy. And by democracy here, I am referring not to a majoritarian parliamentary decision-making mode, but to an open-ended process of deliberation. This comparative claim that an inclusive form of secularism is possible in both countries then leads to conceptual claim that it would also be the most desirable option. Why would an inclusive form of secularism be the most desirable option? Because as I explain in the book, religious voices matter not only for religious believers themselves, but also for democracy as a whole. The pluralism that religious freedom brings is, I argue, beneficial and enriching for democracy. The main goal of the book is therefore to ensure that legal reasoning fosters these vital connections between pluralism, democracy, and religious freedom. To that end, I put forward a democratic approach centered on 3 criteria of avoidance, inclusion, and revision. Very briefly, I would say that the method of avoidance postulates that the state is to refrain from interfering with religious beliefs. Such non-interference, however, will cease to be justified if systemic disadvantage works against minority groups and vulnerable members of society. That is why the second feature, the principle of inclusion, must, I submit, complement the method of avoidance. The principle of inclusion will trigger intervention by the state where need be to redress inequalities. Finally, the principle of revision, the third feature, expresses a notion of reciprocity. Under the principle of revision, citizens are expected to review their commitments in light of the overall political framework, but vice versa, legal solutions are expected to be revisited. Part 2 of the book then brings in the third thread, the legal thread. It explores the consequences of my democratic approach for courts, taking the employment sphere as an area of investigation. Whilst the principle of revision I advocate dictates that precise outcomes must depend on contextual evolving deliberations, guidelines nonetheless emerge for courts. I will just quote 2. The method of avoidance and principle of inclusion combine, for example, to state that courts do not determine in advance which religious practices amount to desirable manifestations, but take on board the claimant's interest in expressing her religious faith, however conspicuous or inconsistent the manifestation may appear at first sight. The democratic approach will also lead courts to scrutinizing the competing interests at play in the workplace without deferring blankly to the employer's or to national courts' own assessment of the tensions. To conclude, through these 3 interconnected comparative, conceptual, and legal judicial threads, the book seeks to foster a more inclusive form of legal reasoning and a more tolerant and vibrant vivre ensemble for our societies in England and France, as studied in the book, and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for a very lucid summary of the book and its contribution. So the first panel focuses on conceptual and theoretical insights and the arguments, conceptual and theoretical arguments put forward in the book. We have 4 speakers. I'll introduce them all at once and then just move straight between them if that's okay, because we're reasons of time. The first speaker is Professor Horatia Muir-Watt, who's a graduate of the Paris Panthéon-Assas and a professor in Sciences Po in Paris, a member of the Institute of International Law and Institut Universitaire de France, as well as the director of the Program of Global Governance Studies. After Professor Muir-Watt, we will have Professor Julian Rivers from Bristol University. He's a graduate of Cambridge and Göttingen University. And at Bristol, he writes and teaches on legal and constitutional theory, public law, and on the relation between law and religion. Third, we have Professor Cécile Laborde, who is now at Nuffield College, Oxford, formerly of UCL. She is as a professor of political theory at Nuffield College, Oxford. She had a major ERC grant, and which resulted, amongst other things, in her book, Liberalism's Religion, published in 2018, I think it is. And finally, also UCL, Dr. Oliver Gerstenberg, who lectures in EU law and also is interested in legal theory. And he has also recently published a monograph called Euro-Constitutionalism and its Discontents. So if we Without further delay, I would like to move on to Professor Horatia Murwat, who will start us off for this panel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to start by telling a very short story. So once upon a time, I knew Miriam as a student of private international law. And so it's very, very wonderful to see her over the other side of the channel and dealing with apparently very, very different topics. It's actually wonderful to see you, I must say. It's a great pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me. So now I'll go back to the story and the thread, rather. Because among the various things that I picked up in the book and that I suggested that I could talk about, Miriam chose my suggestion to go back to private international law. So I'll try to do that, not easy because it's not exactly in the book. Nevertheless, it does join up with what she calls the legal thread that we get to in the book. I think this is such a wonderful time over from this side of the channel to be looking at this topic because, as some of you may know, there's a raging academic debate now about religion, and anybody who says anything vaguely democratic is now being accused of Islamo-gauchisme, which is a concept, I don't even know how to translate it, but it's a concept that has now become a kind of a battle cry against anybody who has any type of progressive thought, and particularly in academia. So that being said, what I'm going to try and show here is that perhaps private international law, which I'll talk about in a minute, which seems very far from the core concern here, is actually much more involved than may first meet the eye, and that perhaps the periphery is closer intellectually to the core than we might think. And so I would like to build three bridges. My intervention comes from the idea of private international law as dealing with in-between spaces. So I'm going to present private international law as the part of the law that deals with, let's say, relationships or law's relationship to alterity. It deals with alterity in legal form. Normatively, I'd like to present it as hospitality towards alterity, but of course, law can be exclusive too, and that's perhaps another debate. My first question about law and alterity is really a question for Miriam, perhaps a rhetorical one, let's say. Because of course, in private international, alterity may well be a religious. In fact, it probably is mostly when one thinks about it. And Miriam worked very much on the question of personal status, which has a very, very strong religious dimension. But private international law branches out, obviously, beyond encounters within the Western tradition. And brings in other types of world vision or other types of other cosmologies, let's say. So I've been working on diasporas and community building in diasporas and the relationship between community and territory. And I'm just wondering how the comparative cultural perspectives that Miriam brings in her book can help us understand, or could be used, could be relevant in cases of encounters with completely other belief systems. So that would be my first point. Is there something that we can draw from this book? I'm sure there is, about much wider types of encounter. The second bridge is about the international and domestic divide. Now, that's a very important thing in private international law, in international law in general. It's probably also something very, very important in political theory too. And I'm just wondering whether once one has been through Miriam's extremely convincing arguments in favor of religious freedom, which clearly does matter, and one follows the legal thread into various, let's say, devices or modes of reasoning, modes of inclusive reasoning or modes of deliberation, what next? In other words, do you think, so this really is a question for Miriam, do you think that the modes of reasoning in private international law whereby one encounters alterity in legal form could be the next step? So that's something, does your other experience, let's say, does your past bring you, your intellectual past, let's say, suggest further ways of imagining, perhaps even beyond proportionality, for instance, how one regulates these encounters. My third point, that's also to do with private international law, is the absolute centrality of this reflection on religion. Now, I'm not going back to Islamo-Gauchisme, although I would love to. But in discussions now on the political economy of global capitalism, which is a private international law topic, there's a lot of reflection now, and as I'm only a lawyer, perhaps I'm saying things that are very obvious for political theorists. There's very much the idea that the driving force of social evolution and indeed revolution is actually not the economy, but religion. To a certain extent, it's a sort of a revenge of the humanities after such the social sciences having been overtaken by economics for so long. A lot of it comes from the Italian school. And I'm thinking of various comparative works such as P.G. Monateri's fantastic Dominus Mundi. And so,
sorry, just about one more minute.
Yes,
Thanks.
Absolutely. My last minute is devoted precisely to the risk. In other words, a lot of the Italian theory revolves around, let's say, things that could be Schmittian concepts, right, about political theology and for and against. So to what extent could the arguments in the book, there again, serve to help us think through this debate that there again goes far outside the English-French comparative dimension. So thank you very much, and thank you so much for, well, for the present of the book and for such a wonderful read.
Thank you very much, Professor Myriam, for those great thoughts and great timekeeping. And without further ado, I'll move on to Professor Julian Rivers.
Thank you very much, Ronan. And again, it's a great pleasure to be here with you, Miriam, and with so many friends and those I don't know yet at this wonderful book launch. And congratulations, as always, on having brought this child to birth and launching it out onto the world to change the world. I want to say a few words about particularly religious establishment in its English form. So in chapter 3 of her book, Miriam argues that the form of religious establishment as it developed in England by the end of the 19th century, by and large works. By works, Miriam means that it contributes to the generation of a desirable type 3 secularism, which is characterized by the method of avoidance, that is, keeping fundamental religious disagreements out of the public domain, the principle of inclusion, that is, ensuring that people of all religions and none are welcome as such within the public domain, and the principle of revision, that is, that the precise terms on which such a liberal democratic vivre ensemble is maintained are subject to reconsideration and change. Miriam's point is that English religious establishment is not merely tolerable or not a problem, but that it makes a positive contribution to the generation of type 3 secularism. A couple of times in the book, Miriam quotes Dieter Grimm with approval, when Dieter Grimm argues for a politics of religion, which I quote, recognizes religion, including minority religions, as an elementary human urge that seeks public expression, an urge that the state not only has to respect, but also protect and maybe even promote. In short, we human beings are spiritual as well as material beings, and the secular state has to come to terms with that fact. Of course, Miriam recognizes that not everything is rosy in the British constitutional garden, but the problems do not arise from church-state relations. Her main example of an unhelpful counter-trend in the UK comes from educational policies associated with fundamental British values, including prevent. Now, it's worth pausing to note the irony of this. Fundamental British values are, as we probably most of us know, democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. That sounds very like type 3 secularism. And liberal democracy is surely synonymous with the abandonment of state confessionalism, of which English religious establishment is the last echo. Hence the irony. It seems rather like trying to land a man on the moon. If you point the rocket directly at the moon, it misses fundamental British values. But if you fire off in some other direction, English church establishment, it miraculously arrives. The question which intrigues me is this: why does English religious establishment work? Is it a miracle, or is it the result of rather precise circumstances? And what does the fact that it works tell us about our normative, political, and constitutional theory? Miriam gives us a few suggestions. Even though there is a form of establishment, religion and politics are in practice largely kept separate. A public religious presence is secured in those areas which matter most to religious people, most notably education and family life. But those points seem to me to be indicators that it is working, not explanations for why it works. So I want to stir in a few other factors which I think may be relevant. First of all, the British Constitution is peculiarly interpretable. This has been true for a very long time. The revolution of 1688-9 was quite deliberately, constructively ambiguous, drawing together both divine right Tories and natural right Whigs. That constructive ambiguity applies today, particularly to the role of the monarch and the place of the Church of England. There is a story of the British Constitution which accentuates the medieval roots of a harmony of church and state under a Christian ruler. There is another story which dismisses this as purely superficial and which tends to suppress these elements. So we reconstruct our own versions of the Constitution and thereby make our civic peace. Second point, the current arrangements reflect an institutional compromise within Christian political theology. We must not ignore the impact of nonconformist or dissenting Protestantism increasingly brought to bear on public life throughout the 19th century. And here we see a principle of personal accountability and institutional separation struggling with a principle of religious nationalism, all of which had very long-standing intellectual roots. This struggle, as I said, a struggle within Christian political theology in the 19th century, resulted in a largely secularized public sphere, specific forms of institutional plurality in the public-private interface, and a concern that respect be shown to individual conscience. The different arrangements in Scotland, Wales, and Ireland reflected the different balances of the denominational mix and the relative majorities and minorities. Scottish Presbyterianism and Welsh Congregationalism have different political implications. In the case of Ireland, of course, we have to stir in the unfolding political theology of Roman Catholicism as well. Third point, the Church of England is itself an incredibly odd institution. It's odd in that it has Catholic, Reformed and Erastian elements. It is odd in that it locates its commonality not in statements of religious doctrine, but in forms of worship. It is odd in the sheer breadth of theology and ethics it encompasses, and it is very odd that it hasn't fallen to bits yet. But for now, the Church of England models a sort of bounded and bonded religious disagreement, and in a curious way, its established position secures the same sort of commonality by constructive ambiguity that we see in the British Constitution more generally.
Well, 1 minute, please.
Thank you. Final point is that the privileged political position of the Church of England, such as it is seen as problematic, and that results in considerable caution when it comes to flexing its political muscles. I think Miriam is right to draw attention in chapter 4 to Stephen Holmes's argument that democracy is based on self-restraint. And that is what we see, I think, in the case of the Church of England as well. Well, what underlies all these thoughts? And here I come to my concluding point. Although we can articulate the concerns of liberal democratic constitutionalism in terms of abstract values, such concerns are only ever embedded in concrete and richer forms of practice and belief. And these have very significant and distinctive historical and theological resonances. It's a consequence of the sort of late Rawlsian political project that Miriam and I, at any rate, are attracted to, that we should pay close attention to the conditions under which it is possible to be both religiously and ethically committed and also tolerant of others. And I think that the contemporary culture wars show that that need is as pressing as ever. So I applaud Miriam for bringing these dimensions to the surface in her book, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to engage with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rivers. Again, good timekeeping and stimulating thoughts. And now we'll move on to Professor Cécile Laborde.
Thanks very much, Ronan. I greatly enjoyed reading Miriam's book. I agree with what she says about France, about Britain, about current warring trends in European law generally, and I admire her democratic framework. My comments focus on religious freedom and discrimination. So I want to offer a few comments on Miriam's conceptualization of religious freedom in chapter 4, before I move to reflecting on cases she discusses in chapter 5. So Miriam defends the specialness of religious freedom, quasi-religious, against what she calls secular analogues, theorists such as myself, so theorists who she worries dilute or dissolve religious freedom into a merely secular interest. So let me briefly comment on this characterization, and then I move on to say where I agree with Miriam. So my favorite view is that religious beliefs and practices can be exempted from general laws, from justified laws, because they exhibit a general value that both religious and non-religious people can appreciate, and that's the value of integrity. So integrity implies a correspondence between one's deep commitments and one's actions, and it is instantiated in religious as well as some non-religious ways of life, from humanist conscientious objection to ethical vegetarianism. Now, Miriam worries that to think of religion as merely an instantiation of a broader moral value is to trivialize it, but I'm not sure about this. So it seems to me that in pluralistic societies, we need to appeal to values that are as non-sectarian as possible. And it's not clear to me that religious freedom would be more securely protected if it were presented as a uniquely special liberty, pursuing distinct and discrete interests. After all, that's the view shared by critics of religious freedom. So philosophers such as Brian Leiter and many atheist philosophers single out religious beliefs as particularly problematic, relying on irrational or blind faith. But on the integrity conception, by contrast, there is something respectable about searching the good and the truth in your own way. And the protection of religious freedom is one of the ways in which we protect this deep human interest. So in short, where Miriam sees secular interest, I see a human interest. But Miriam and I are in agreement, however, on another crucial point. So we both worry about the tendency among certain secular analogues, thinkers, to protect religion only in the name of equality and non-discrimination. That is, only if comparable secular interests are also protected. So we both raised worries about Eisgruber and Sager's legal method and their elusive search for a comparator group, that is, a group against which the disadvantage suffered by religious believers can be measured. As Miriam notes, my integrity conception does not require comparator. So we don't need to show that religious believers are discriminated against in relation to other groups to establish that their freedom of religion is infringed. It's sufficient to show that an important interest of theirs is burdened. So I prefer to distinguish between two cases, what I call majority bias, so broadly covers cases of discrimination, and disproportionate burden, which cover cases of religious freedom infringement. So we have majority bias, discrimination cases, and religious freedom, or disproportionate burden. And Miriam's view, and I totally agree, is that we do not need to establish discrimination to show that religious freedom has been infringed. But here's the puzzle I want to explore. So nearly all the cases that Miriam discusses in chapter 5 are cases of discrimination. So arguably, qua complaints of discrimination, they rely on identifying a comparator group that is unfairly advantaged. But what exactly is that group? And that's a crucial question, it seems to me, one that's not been adequately addressed in the literature. So for cases such as H-beta to count as cases of discrimination, we must identify the relevant comparator group. So I want to explore briefly 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, the comparator group is made of the members of the religious majority. So that's plausible. Christians do not typically have to wear religious signs as part of their religious practice, and therefore they are advantaged by a law banning religious signs. Because European public spheres have been shaped by Christian norms, working week, day of rest, norms of appearance, etc., Christian norms still invisibly permeate current social arrangements, and they provide a kind of headwind for religious majorities. So this scenario, I think, fits neatly with the spirit of indirect discrimination. So the rule appears neutral, but in fact, it compounds existing relations of historic subordination. Think of the Greeks case in the US. So indirect discrimination does not protect any group, but only subordinated groups. And here the subordinated groups are religious non-Christian minorities, such as Muslims, who suffer disadvantage by virtue of living in a majority Christian or post-Christian society. So on this view, the accommodation of minorities is in fact a re-establishment of equality. So it's the establishment of a more neutral baseline. But of course, this raises an important issue, right? How about clothing rules that have a disparate impact on Christians? How about a waiter? So that's a crucifix-wearing British Airways employee. On scenario 1, she would not have a case. Yet on the face of it, her claim seems not radically different from H-beta. So there are 2 routes out of this. First one is scenario 2. So here the relevant comparator group is made of secular people, those who do not have religious obligations that are burdened by the law. H-beta and Awada are comparatively disadvantaged in relation to non-believers. This is the argument also presented by Chris McCrudden, who's here, when he was acting as a counsel in the case of Ladell, the Islington registrar who refuses to perform same-sex partnerships, to officiate, same-sex partnerships. The relevant comparator group here is made up of staff members who do not have a conscientious objection to registering civil partnerships. Clearly, this view is attractive. It brings religious majorities under the protection of discrimination law. From the secular state's perspective, Christians are indeed minorities. They are one religious group among others, and they no longer enjoy a position of dominance. Religious believers are discriminated against, qua believers. They are disadvantaged by comparison with secular people who are not burdened by secular laws.
1 minute.
Oh, the problem with this view, I think, is that it's not enough to say that one group is advantaged by a law. You must show that they enjoy an unfair advantage. For example, that the law tracks existing relations of subordination, Otherwise, the disadvantage is merely the one caused by the law. But then we have an absurd reduction because all laws disadvantage some and advantage others. So we need to say more about the sense in which the group of secular people is a group of socially salient group, one that does dominate and subordinate religious people. Some might find this view plausible, but briefly, I just mentioned the other possibility, which is scenario 3. And that says, look, we don't need to identify a comparator group because the cases are wrongly framed as cases of discrimination. But in fact, they are religious freedom cases what I call disproportionate burden rather than majority bias. So someone's religious freedom is burdened disproportionately regardless of how others fare. So Ueda and Ladell have a religious freedom claim, but they are not, properly speaking, discriminated against. So my question to Miriam is this: which scenario would she prefer? Now, as a non-lawyer, I intend this as a theoretical question, a question about philosophical foundations, not a legal question. I understand the law has a different answer, of course. But given Miriam's skepticism towards comparative approaches to religious protection, would she welcome the reframing of these cases as religious freedom cases rather than discrimination cases? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Laborde, on our excellent intervention. And finally, for this panel, I'll call on Dr. Oliver Gerstenberg to start his presentation. Thanks.
Good. Thank you for having me on board as well, and thank you for this wonderful book. And I will have nothing but praise and admiration to offer for the book, from which I learned a lot. So the book says that there is an important democratic strand in the case for religious freedom. And I think that is what makes the book particularly original. That strand is about enabling us to reason together as political equals. Strong protections of religious freedom are not only about protecting religious conviction, conscience, etc., from intrusive regulation. They are also about the inclusion of equals in a process of deliberation. And this process of co-deliberation in turn ensures the ongoing revisability of the constitutional terms of our vivre ensemble in a fast-changing, morally diverse society. So, the democratic approach allows us to avoid relying on a foundational ethical conception, such as ethical individualism or personal autonomy. Instead, it relies on the idea of self-revision itself, suitably specified. Secondly, the democratic approach leads sometimes allows for special protection for religious freedom as warranted compared to philosophical or non-religious beliefs. So let me take you through these two points very briefly. It is often argued that in defining what constitutes a domain of right and justice, we simply cannot avoid endorsing a partisan philosophical view of value. So everything is metaphysical or partisan in that sense. Liberal neutrality is just a bluff. According to such a view, liberals only pretend to protect and defer to the plurality of beliefs within a liberal society, when in fact they want to place their own institutions and their own doctrine of freedom as beyond argument. So it's a hegemonic move. It's a form of bad faith. And this criticism can be made from the left and from the right. We know it. So it is, if you will, a reiteration of what Sheila Ben Habib has called the Weimar syndrome: how to defend modern constitutional republics intellectually and institutionally in an age of value pluralism and class conflicts. The response now to this, which the book pursues, and very much in line with John Rawls's work, is to say the defense of political liberalism does not depend on a metaphysical doctrine, but we posit the idea of reasoned deliberative justification as shared and self-validating and shared practice. So what Rawls says, liberalism as a fighting faith. Yeah, so the definite idea for deliberative democracy, as Rawls says, is the idea of deliberation itself. So we do not rely in a Hobbesian way on private interests and or bargaining, but the idea of a discursive process. As co-deliberators, we suppose that our political opinions may be revised in discussion with other citizens, and therefore these opinions are not simply a fixed outcome of existing private non-political interests. So it's the idea of public reason, and that in turn, as Miriam explains, is guided by the criterion of reciprocity, which requires that when terms of cooperation are proposed as the most reasonable terms, those of us proposing them must also think it at least reasonable for others to accept those terms as free and equal citizens, and not as dominated or manipulated or under the pressure of an inferior political or social position. So reasonableness is here a political value and not one embedded in a comprehensive view. We do not start outside political argument, but we are always internally within that argument. Now, the upshot of that is to say that when religious liberty of some citizens is to be denied, we must offer them reasons. That's the deliberative element, and failure to do so, the denial of religious liberty with it, amounts to not only to an infringement of a private right, but to exclusion from a shared space of reasons, and thereby diminishes our democratic citizenship. So that is the first connection. Now, the second point is religious freedom special. The concern here is that we damage politics by fueling social conflict if we believe that religious freedom is special. So the concern is here that standoff will result, and religious freedom is being weaponized in a polarized society to opt out of anti-discrimination law requirements. And this concern might prompt us to say that religion is not special, but it is just derivative. It is just another negative freedom, such as freedom of speech or privacy, etc. So nothing special about it. However, the discontent which Miriam's book voices with regard to that position is the following. So, for example, Habermas has argued that religious traditions articulate moral intuitions, and the liberal state has an interest of its own in unleashing religious voices in the public sphere. And similarly, Josh Cohen, drawing on both Habermas and Rawls, says that religious conviction has been a source, or at least a vehicle, for arriving at, or at least for powerfully expressing in vivid form, ethical insight, sometimes with a large and constructive political implication. Think of the civil rights movement, or think of resistance against Nazism in where I come from originally. And in that connection, also, religion is phenomenologically different from, say, veganism, because, so from another comprehensive view, because it offers a unified system of belief which guides the whole life and therefore becomes a deep moral resource, which in turn influences politics. So the upshot of this point is, the second point is that an interest in conflictual moral diversity, we have an interest in conflictual moral diversity in order to expand the space of the political and allow for self-criticism and self-revision of the constitutional terms under which we cooperate. So a morally diverse society enables self-revision. And the final point now is the following observation. These cases which Miriam discusses in the book are not about the burning questions about restoring and strengthening the ideal of reciprocity in the economic sphere of markets. So what Horatia mentioned, the idea of religion being more important than markets. So it is not about markets, and it is not about poverty and wealth discrepancy. It is not about violence and racism, or not directly, but the cases are symptomatic of a polarized and increasingly toxic political culture characterized by facts of easy offense and victimhood and the appearance of absence of common ground. So the new Weimar syndrome. And here the book argues that reciprocity requires a background political culture of conflictual moral diversity to avoid false closure. And so the constant exposure of our constitutional self-understandings as a polity to the shocks of diverse experience, and thereby their ongoing self-revision of the terms of our living together in the interest of enhanced inclusiveness. So that is my own takeaway from the book. Miriam must tell me whether I'm right or wrong with that. In any case, I benefited from it, and I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you to you all for those fascinating comments and great timekeeping. I should have said, I think I forgot at the start, that any questions you have for the Q&A, please put them in the chat. But with that, thank you to all the speakers, and I'll hand over to the chair of the next panel, Julian Rivers.
Thank you very much, Ronan. And I was going to say thank you to the panelists, but that feels slightly indulgent for keeping such good time. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second panel session, which is logically enough on part 2 of Miriam's book. In this part, as I'm sure you're aware, Miriam subjects a number of recent cases involving religious employees or employers to critical scrutiny. Are our courts contributing to or undermining the liberal democratic vivre ensemble we should be seeking to secure? To discuss this and related questions, we have 4 distinguished panelists. I only have time to introduce them very briefly, but here they are. First, Professor Ronan McRae, Professor of Constitutional and European Law at University College London. His research focuses on comparative constitutional law, European Union law, and public law, with a particular emphasis on the future of the European Union and on the relationship between law and religion in liberal democracies. As a barrister, he also practices in these areas. Professor Christopher McCrudden is Professor of Human Rights and Equality Law at Queen's University Belfast and William W. Cook Global Law Professor at the University of Michigan Law School. His main research focus is on human rights law, and he too is a member of the bars of England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Professor Lucy Vickers is Professor of Law at Oxford Brookes University. Her main research area is the protection of human rights within the workplace. In particular, she focuses on religious discrimination at work and age equality. And finally, Professor Sir Malcolm Evans is Professor of Public International Law at the University of Bristol. In recent years, he's also been chair of the United Nations Subcommittee for the Prevention of Torture and a panel member of the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. He has, of course, written extensively on freedom of religion and belief in an international and European context. So it gives me a pleasure to welcome our 4 panelists, and I will straight away move on to Ronan to ask you to make your comments.
Thank you. I'd like to add my praise to Miriam's really wonderful, rich book, and thank you all for coming in today. So in the minutes I have available, I want to look at Miriam's analysis of the rulings of the European Court of Justice in the cases of Achpita and Bugnawi. I want to highlight a couple of areas where I think Miriam's analysis is spot on, and then 1 or 2 areas where I have a different perspective. So I mainly think that Miriam is correct that notions of laïcité and vivre ensemble are being misused and sometimes being converted into quite illiberal rules and practices. I want to give you a few specifics first about the cases, just in case you don't know, but in Ms. Achpita's case, she was fired as the result of an application of a company policy that prohibited employees from wearing any religious or signs of religious or philosophical belief. In Ms. Bugnawi's case, it came from a refusal to abide by an instruction for her employer that itself resulted from a request from a client that there be no headscarf next time. So to simplify a little bit in the interest of time, the Court of Justice of the European Union ruled that employers could impose a requirement of neutrality on employees as long as they did so in a way that was consistently applied to all forms of religion and belief. Rules that targeted the symbols of one faith, on the other hand, couldn't be justified. And in coming to this conclusion, the Court of Justice relied partly on the right to freedom of religion and freedom from discrimination, but also Article 16 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which covers the right to run a business. And they relied on that to say that employers could potentially take client preferences into account in requiring employees not to wear religious or political symbols. And in doing so, the court backed Advocate General Cocotte. Advocates General advised the court on how they should rule in these cases. They backed Advocate General Cocotte's contention in the Ashbita case that religion was not like other protected grounds, such as race or sex, because religion could be changed. And she said that a ban on religious symbols was effectively the same as a ban on wearing political symbols. This is contrary to the advice of Advocate General Sharpston and Bugnawi, who took a more Miriam-friendly approach and argued that religion was part of the core of a person's identity, and employees could not be asked to leave it at the workplace door any more than they could be asked to put their ethnicity or sex at the door, the workplace door. Now, disappointingly, I think the two Advocates General kind of talked past each other. One saw religion as equivalent to political belief. The other saw it as equivalent to an immutable identity like race or sex. Neither of them really engaged with the complex reality that religion is both of these things. So what actually we needed were criteria for when religion should be treated as an opinion and when it should be treated as a form of identity, rather than, as they did, rather talking past each other. Now, Miriam is critical of the Court of Justice's rulings. She rightly, I think, queries Advocate General Cocotte's invocation of a deference towards French laïcité as a reason for the court to take a hands-off view in this employment discrimination case, because she notes correctly that the principles of laïcité are not applicable to private sector employees. She also argues that the deference shown by the court tends, and I'll quote her here, to reduce the proportionality test to a verification of procedural consistency, which unduly favors the employer. Now, for Miriam, the problem isn't laïcité. She says that laïcité, properly understood, should actually push the court to be less tolerant of private sector restrictions. As she says, I'll quote her again, the 1905 law, this is the French law on separation of church and state, contains many traits which place laïcité within the democratic approach. In accordance with the method of avoidance, the 1905 law delineates a political sphere free from national or religious ideology, and sought to protect freedom of conscience in the private and non-state public spheres. By improving the fate of religious minorities, the 1905 law also went some way towards a principle of inclusion attentive to marginalized citizens. The challenges of Islam in modern times have instead provoked a retreat into illiberalism, end quote. So for Miriam, legitimate principles such as laïcité and maybe vivre ensemble are increasingly being developed in ways that are unduly restrictive and exclusionary. Her democratic approach is one in which this tendency can be counteracted, and these principles returned to their previous, more satisfactory state. They are, she thinks, principles that need to be tweaked and brought back to their noble roots, not discarded. It's a view that I think has a lot to commend it, but maybe pessimistically I have doubts about it. I agree that these concepts are subject to abuse, but also have merits. But I don't agree that if sufficiently tweaked by democratic approaches, the efficacy of principles like laïcité and vivre ensemble can be restored to their role as just and effective ways of regulating religion's role in European societies, a role that Miriam feels they once had. And that's because I just think the magnitude of changes that Europe is going through are too great. After a millennium when the vast majority of Europeans were believing Christians, the last few decades have seen a sudden collapse in belief and practice. Non-belief has gone from small minority to predominant approach. The same decades have seen a significant rise in the Muslim population. Any one of these changes would be likely to produce an endless series of unforeseeable changes. Taken together, they mean all, and if you add in a sexual revolution that's challenging for a lot of traditional religions, it means all of the chips have been thrown in the air. Regulating religion and religions and its role in the state and society in the context of a Christian society with some non-believers is an entirely different project from regulating religion in the context of a predominant non-believing population, a declining Christian population, and a rising Muslim population whose predominant theological approaches have much less acceptance of separation of religion and state. As I said, add in the sexual revolution, and I just think we don't know where we're going. Implicit in Miriam's view is that laïcité and vivre ensemble have become broken. Implicit in that view that they're broken, is the idea that there was a previous era where they or other established models successfully managed the kind of religious diversity that we have in Europe today. But actually, we haven't had—
1 minute.
Thank you. We haven't had this kind of religious diversity before, and we don't have any precedents about how best to manage this situation. Whether one draws with an approach that encourages coexistence by encouraging reticence on all our parts on about our religious views in shared spaces like the workplace works best, or whether one that encourages us all to let it all hang out and express our identities in all these areas is best, we don't know. And I think in circumstances of this radical uncertainty, it would be immodest for a court, like international court, like the Court of Justice, to think it can identify the proper approach and impose it on 27 EU states. We don't have precedents, but we have principles, and Miriam's democratic approach involves many good principles that could be a useful resource as we feel our way in the dark about how to manage this situation. But useful as these principles are, they don't shrink the magnitude of the task we face. The situation is now so different from what we had before that whatever comes next, I think will have to be largely constructed anew. Tweaking structures designed for a wholly different past won't suffice. Miriam's democratic approach will be useful, but as one tool in the construction of this project. But I don't think it's useful as a way to return to a remedy, and so we can return to a less dysfunctional past. And I think the Court of Justice's modesty in its approach in this regard was right. In circumstances of uncertainty, you cannot decide for 27 states what the best approach is. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ronan, for your thoughts on that. And I turn immediately to Chris McCrudden. You're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, and thank you for the invitation to contribute to this panel. So the very last section of this really wonderfully stimulating book indicates clearly that it was completed before the Brexit deal was finalized in December 2020. So in these brief comments, I want to explore a little the implications of recent events in Brexit. And resulting from that, I want to suggest that in addition to the law of religious freedom and the philosophy of religious freedom, we should also be conscious of the politics of religious freedom. So taking that into account leads me to be pessimistic that Miriam's vision stands very much chance of successful implementation in England, at least anytime soon. So let's start with a simple observation. The law of religious freedom in England very largely consists of a recycled import from continental Europe, whether in the form of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights on Article 9 and Article 14, or in the form of EU law, particularly the Framework Directive. It's true, of course, that UK judges have contributed to that jurisprudence, and I don't want in any way to belittle their involvement. It's not an entirely one-way street, of course, but the fact remains that without this European stimulus, the law of religious freedom in England, Wales, and Scotland would look very different. And given the moves to weaken the Human Rights Act, to continue the threat of leaving the ECHR in the future, an actual withdrawal from the EU, what religious freedom law will look like in a decade's time is quite uncertain. The anti-Europeanism that underlies all these developments bodes ill for the greater tolerance and pluralism that Miriam advocates. And remember, all of this is being done in the name of democracy and democratic participation. So the idea, by the way, that England should now look to its history and rediscover its tolerance, openness, and pluralism in religious matters, whether politically or at common law, is likely, I have to say, to be greeted with some skepticism. Indeed, I hope not offensively, a hollow laugh, at least from where I'm sitting at the moment, on the shores of Strangford Lough in Northern Ireland, a few miles from a place called Bloody Bridge, where Catholic prisoners were massacred by Protestants after an abortive Catholic uprising against anti-Catholic discrimination in 1641. Not that we tend to remember these things, of course. And so in many ways, of course, Northern Ireland is a place apart, having had indeed a constitutionalized religious freedom provision since its creation in 1921, and extensive prohibitions against religious discrimination in employment and beyond since 1976. Northern Ireland has also, of course, had the benefit of the Human Rights Act and EU legal provisions, in addition to these constitutional and sui generis statutory prohibitions. The result is one of the most extensive sets of religious freedom law in Europe and beyond, underpinned indeed by the Good Friday Peace Agreement. Miriam makes clear, I have to say, that she's not dealing with Northern Ireland and is careful to refer to her jurisdictional focus as England. But the implications of the Northern Ireland experience, I think, may shed some skeptical light on her thesis. What's noteworthy about this Northern Ireland acquis is that the overwhelming bulk of these provisions were externally imposed, not legislated for, by the old Northern Ireland Parliament before 1970, or the new Northern Ireland Assembly. In fact, so far as I'm aware, apart from being given the opportunity to vote in favour of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in a referendum, the only local democratic participation in legislating these protections was the presence of a small group of Northern Ireland politicians in Westminster, who were, I have to say, consistently outvoted by the votes of MPs from outside Northern Ireland, and quite right too. And this theme of external imposition, of course, continues, here's the Brexit element, in the Ireland-Northern Ireland Protocol, which in Article 2 prevents the future diminution of rights guaranteed in the Belfast Agreement, which are underpinned by EU law, including the Framework Agreement and Directive, and guarantees that Northern Ireland remains in lockstep with the EU in the future in this respect. And the right of the Assembly to get rid of the protocol in 4 years' time does not apply to this provision, which continues in perpetuity. And again, quite right too. Why? Because given the opportunity, it seems highly likely that the DUP would otherwise vote against this provision, bringing the agreement down with it. And so we come back to the question of the relationship between democracy and religious freedom and equality. And that's what I want to focus on in these last few minutes. Given the past few years, I have to say, it's a pretty tough ask that links the protection of human rights, including the rights that we're concerned with today, to democratic decision-making. Fortunately, I'm not a politician, and so I can say what seems to me to be obvious. The benefit of subjecting fundamental rights to the stupidity and prejudices of an ill-informed and blinkered electorate is not at all clear to me. There are, I think, some rights, and religious freedom and equality included, that we should consider to be preconditions of the democratic process, not the result of that process. So there's more than a hint of this in Miriam's book, but I think it's too dilute, at least too dilute for me, to come through with the clarity and strength that current circumstances require. And this coyness, if I can call it that, is manifest, I think, in the strange absence of a concept that I would have thought captures the importance of religious freedom and equality as prior to democracy, namely human dignity. The idea that we have certain rights simply in virtue of our status as human beings. really rather similar to the point I think that Dieter Grimm was making, that Oliver referred to earlier on. Now, there are in fact 2 mentions of dignity in the book, but both are quotations from other authors, and these hints are not followed up.
1 minute.
Given that all the great religions of the book, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all base religious freedom on this foundation, given the extent to which both EU and ECHR law is beginning to build on this concept, its absence in the book is striking, and I think problematic. It's perhaps not surprising, given the hostility to the concept among some intellectuals in France and the absence of engagement with the concept in England, but that's precisely why the weakening of England's engagement with Europe is so worrying, since it's precisely from that source that the fundamental, indeed foundational underpinnings of religious liberty in dignity would be likely to flow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your thoughts and reflections on that. And I turn straight away to Lucy Vickers, who will take the floor next. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to thank you for having me today. And just to say that I really enjoyed the book. And I do feel it brings a new dimension to our thinking with its focus on the role of religion and belief as part of a framework that upholds democracy. And the elaboration of the 3 principles articulates aspects of the legal framework and then refines our understanding of those principles so that we can use them to develop a better normative approach to interpreting and applying the law. I want to reflect on a few issues that arose for me in the reading. As some of you all know, I've come to the study of religious freedom from an equality background, and so I want to reflect on some of Miriam's conclusions from an equality perspective. In my view, these are not perspectives that are in conflict. Indeed, Miriam's second principle, of course, is one of inclusion, and so it has as its heart the issue of equality. But I wanted this contribution not just to be an endless refrain of "I agree with Miriam." So I'll frame what additional factors we may be able to add to Miriam's analysis if we come to the issue from the perspective of equality. And taking on board Cecile's comments earlier, arguing that it's not necessary to have an equality framework as the basis of protection, at least that's what I understood you to be saying. I think nonetheless an equality perspective gives us some additional food for thought. So the various workplace issues discussed in Miriam's book reflect where the case law has arrived, and as has been pointed out, they often have involved workplace equality claims for a balance of rights between employers and employees, either in terms of dress codes, Attribita, Bugnery, and in the human rights context, OEDA, and later cases also that have come since the publication of the book on dress codes, and also the rights of employers to require compliance with religious teaching, Egenberger and Obst, etc. So in each case, these issues can be understood as human rights-based claims or as equality-based claims, and indeed the book illustrates how the issues have been discussed using both frameworks, Attribita and OEDA, the dress code cases, or Egenberger and Obstenschut in relation to employers' obligations. So in both cases, having shown different underpinning rights, both frameworks ultimately turn on an analysis based on proportionality. So having said that, I want to move away from just saying I agree with Miriam. Nonetheless, I do want to reinforce that I think that it's right that proportionality is the correct way forward in terms of balancing these complex issues. And as I've argued in my publications, any other mechanism is likely to end up with reduced protection for religious rights. If we're to say anything definitive, do you have a right to wear the headscarf, we're likely to end up with the answer no, because we can all think of reasons and contexts where this right might not be appropriate. So we have to have some nuance. Nuance, I think, is the friend of religious protection. And I enjoyed Miriam's careful consideration of the cases, showing ways in which the courts have perhaps got the balance a bit out of kilter. I'm not sure I always agree with every one of her conclusions. I think, for example, that Adele is probably correctly decided by the European Court of Human Rights. Sorry, Chris. But I absolutely agree that there may have been better ways to have managed the situation at an earlier stage in the litigation. But I do agree that fact-sensitive review is the way forward. So what would an equality framework add? And I guess what I'm saying here is that these additions can usefully be added to Miriam's list of factors that should be taken into account in assessing proportionality. Well, first of all, I think that the idea of the margin of appreciation, when approached from an equality perspective, has a few dangers. It's that the idea is well developed by Miriam, but it does raise concerns because it suggests that courts may move away from standard setting, which it has been willing to do for other grounds, towards too much deference for potentially very unequal treatment. And this links to the second aspect of an equality framework that that I think could add further nuance to the discussion. And that is that there are various conceptions of equality which interact with religion in various ways. So the understanding of equality that's often assumed to underpin a concern with religious equality is the need for equal recognition of our fundamental choices and worldviews, and a respect for dignity, as Chris just mentioned. So my belief in Christianity should be protected equally with your belief in Islam or Hinduism. And of course, from here comes the idea that that equally someone's non-belief or desire for neutrality should be protected too. But there are other meanings of equality, in particular one based on disadvantage, and particularly socioeconomic disadvantage, where religion comes into play. So, for example, there's a correlation between religion and belief and economic disadvantage identified through census data, for example, showing that Muslims have the lowest rates of economic activity. And of course, the reasons for this may vary, but there is evidence that this disadvantage is caused, at least in part, by religious discrimination. Adding into any proportionality equation an understanding of disadvantage that can be caused by religion will enrich any proportionality analysis. Issues which could then be taken into account could include the level of economic or social disadvantage suffered by the religious group and any stigma attached to the religion in question. It would also enable weight to be given to any socioeconomic disadvantage associated with the religious group, and could give considerable protection where the restriction on the manifestation of religion at work leads effectively to the denial of the opportunity to work. And moreover, here it's worth noting that, of course, this may be entirely unlinked to the agenda of recognising the unique role of religion in the lives of the believer. The economic disadvantage may be the result of discrimination which has nothing to do with the expression of religious belief. Could be the result, for example, of discrimination because of the person's name. And that, I think, just raises the issue made in the Ibrahimian case that a person who assumes they may be disadvantaged by being served by a Muslim may just as easily make that assumption when they see a name tag with an Islamic sounding name as they do by the wearing of the headscarf. The third insight offered by an equality framework is the notion of intersectionality, that different equality characteristics interact with each other in complex ways, and that each category of characteristic can be understood in different ways depending on the combination with other characteristics. So the obvious one is the interaction of gender and religion in the case of headscarves, but also religion and race in the case of Islam too. And some have pointed out links between race and the more conservative forms of Christianity that were at stake in some of the cross-wearing cases, for example. So I think intersectionality is another sort of aspect of the equality thinking that could usefully be engaged with here. And I think an equality framework also helps to articulate more fully why an approach based on neutrality isn't neutral. I think that may help to refute some of the suggestions in Achbitter and reiterate it again in the later case, that employers deciding to go with a neutral approach is somehow neutral as between everyone. An appreciation of disadvantage caused by religion, I think, is helpful here. Effectively, it's important, and Miriam acknowledges this, to be aware that policies which appear neutral may in fact limit the freedom to manifest religion or belief and will impact on some religions more than others. For example, it may be more difficult for religions based on orthopraxy to comply with neutrality rules than those based on orthodoxy. So they have fewer external rules to comply with, and let alone the fact, as already pointed out by Cecile, that Christianity is anyway entrenched in Western ways of life, so days off on Sunday, for example. So in effect, what equality concepts give is a language and concepts to more fully explain the interests at work in these cases where religion clashes with the needs of a business. It might be helpful here to draw on the language from disability discrimination jurisprudence and its recognition of the concept of a social model of equality. This allows for greater focus on the lived experience of disadvantage caused by religious identity and practice. again, I'm not saying that we can't recognise these issues within Miriam's framework. It's just to point out that there are additional insights which can be traced to a framework based on equality, which I think can create additional insights to her overall approach. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for absolute perfect timing and for the substance of your interventions as well, of course. So we turn to our final speaker this afternoon, which is Professor Malcolm Evans. Malcolm, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm trying to work out whether I knew I would be the last speaker when I entitled these brief reflections, "Isn't it time we all moved on?" Whatever else is the case, I'm sure by the time you finish speaking, we will have unanimity that it is. But what I would like to do in this time is perhaps just sort of pan back a little from some of the perhaps more focus points which people have been reflecting on. And really combine a few observations about the framework that is offered by Miriam in the first part of the book, a few comments about some of the cases in the second, where that leaves us, then go into the think about the book, is the clarity of the three models of relationship surrounding the vivre ensemble, which Miriam sets out, which at least to me appear essentially functional in nature. And I tend to rename them slightly in my mind and see them really as three ways of achieving that vivre ensemble. The first is avoidance. The second, what is described as inclusion, I tend to call coexistence. And the third, revision, which is a way of achieving coexistence, I tend to see as a way of achieving cohabitation, if you like, within society. So we can get on by avoiding each other, by coexisting with each other, or really getting, if I can use the expression, getting to grips with each other in that sense. But living together, when you stop to think of it, to me at least, tends to rule out the first of those as what I would call as a positive model of achieving the vivre ensemble, as obviously as Miriam points out herself, whereas the sort of the second and the third are more positive ways of achieving it. But stepping back for a moment, avoidance. Now, I think we all know avoidance isn't much of a way of living together, is it? Indeed, it really, what is it about? It's about the grudging acceptance of a presence which on balance we would probably choose to do without, but we're not really free to do so. So we find our way of shall we say, managing relationships by avoiding getting in each other's way. You could say in the traditional language of religious freedom, religious liberty, it's more akin to toleration. No bad thing, maybe the best you can get, maybe good enough. But is it really living together? Possibly not. Moving on then, we come to coexistence, which is a sort of a weak positive in that sense. It accepts, to use that much overused expression, that we are all in this together, but it prefers to be all in this together on my own terms, a sort of come join me way of thinking about how we get on together. And of course, we'll come on to it later. What Miriam is suggesting is there a way of moving on from that, and we'll see whether we can. But within that sort of tripartite typology, it does seem to me that it's at this point that the jurisprudence seems to have got stuck, particularly when we look at not only the ECHR, but the ECJ, and time is against me, so I won't go into inevitably and properly all that in detail. But if we look at the ECJ decisions, which others have already discussed at some length, they can appear frankly fairly bizarre to the external observer, not schooled in the sort of discussions that we are having today. What they will say to many, in effect, is that if a company has a policy which is designed to ensure employees do not cause offence, then the company can enforce that policy against employees, even if no offence is being given. If a company does not have such a policy, it cannot take action against someone whose actions actually are causing offence to customers. Neither, we can argue about the rights and wrongs of this synthesis, but neither position really seems to reflect the idea of living together except on the other person's terms. In other words, firmly rooted in that second space. And indeed, having spent more time than is doubtless good for me reflecting on the various cases considered today and considered in the book, something tends to stand out for me. And that is that whilst there is much focus on the assessment of the objective impact of the behaviour which is called into question on others, there is rarely much overt or equal consideration of the impact of the prohibition of that action on the person who is actually asked to change their behaviour as a result of that consideration. A point that Cecile, I think, noted in her contribution earlier. It's a clash of rights rather than a clash of impacts. Now, doubtless that is probably inevitable, particularly if we are seeing this as a human rights issue. But what stands or arguably hides behind these rights? You know, is a policy more important than a personality? We tend to say, of course, that the policy is intended to pursue the legitimate aim, but is this enough when its application is actually causing offence or hurt to the person against whom it is being enforced, when there is no similar commensurate effect on others? The rights offender in such situations often seems to be reduced a little short of an object in that consideration. And within that broader consideration, of course, we then tend to try to address these in terms of, should we say, societal values and intersections. And I mention this because in the real world, is this how people really tend to behave? What they actually do, I think, is tend to move along a continuum. And if we think about the three positions which I outlined at the beginning, they're not static and they're not alternative. One leads into the other, moves from each other. They blur, they meld, they mold over time. And a jurisprudence that fails to allow the space for individuals to move from coexistence to cohabitation, I don't know that that can really ever be a truly positive contribution to the democratic vivre ensemble. In short, I think we need to be able to move our relationships on, just as in life people tend to do. And it's a shame that what one could call the charybdis that are the courts here, the endless grinding of clashing rocks between which those struggling to forge their vivre ensemble are sometimes placed, just does not seem to want to let them to be able to do so. And it certainly doesn't seem to be very encouraging of this. I think it's worth reminding us, thank you. I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the idea of the vivre ensemble derives from the justification given by the European Court of Human Rights, of course, in SAS in France, upholding the French ban on wearing full face coverings in public, since such masking of the face inhibits the normal social interactions which the court accepted were necessary for democratic life, and such a ban therefore sought to protect the rights and freedoms of others and fell within the state's margin of appreciation. And of course, someone's got to say it, it might be observed in passing that the rights and freedoms of others currently require the masking of the face in public in France and everywhere else, and it is the failure to do so which now prevents social interaction and attracts legal sanction, or did or may shortly, who knows, watch at 6 o'clock. But this is now, and this is then. But yet, isn't that exactly the point? Things change. Attitudes change, reasons change. But does the jurisprudence and the debate around them get conducted in a way that facilitates that quite in the way that it should? And my final reminder here is the freedom of religion and belief is, dare I say it, actually a human right. And the point of a human right, at least to me, is that it should seek to protect individuals from capricious governmental interference. It needs no other justification. To that extent, it doesn't really matter whether or why religious freedom matters for democracy. It matters for the individual, and surely that should be enough. That said, it is certainly good to know that the protection of the right does indeed contribute to the flourishing of democratic society more generally, as all human rights should. And it is absolutely the case that the contribution that Miriam has made in the book to understanding how that comes about is something that we should be very grateful to her for making. So thank you very much indeed.
And thank you, Malcolm, for your thoughts. I see from our program that at 17:25, we are supposed to invite Miriam to respond to the speakers, and it is currently 17:26. So I count that as a signal failure on our collective parts, but one which is distributed in very small proportions between us. So I'm going to hand over now. I'm not sure if Ronan is chairing your response, Miriam, but whether he is or not, I'm sure we were all very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on those 8 very different contributions. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Thank you, everyone, for those kind compliments, insightful comments, and difficult questions. I speak under the control of 2 chairs, probably, so I don't think I'll have time in the short space allocated to me to reply in full to those extremely rich presentations. But perhaps I will pick up on a few common threads, and perhaps the Q&A or other opportunities will give me the occasion to respond more fully later. So there was a question about equality raised by Cécile Labarthe's reflections, and also Lucy Vickers' comments. I would say that I, like Cécile, I have no qualms about extending the protection of religious beliefs to secular commitments. So it's not for me a matter of choosing the right comparative group like Eisgruber or Sager to justify the protection of religious beliefs. And like Cécile, I think that we can't conclude from the observation that some secular commitments would meet the criteria which warrant the protection of religious beliefs, that the category of religious beliefs only exists in order to ensure equivalence between religious and secular commitments. Because I agree that secular beliefs should be protected as well, the specialness I confer to religious beliefs is not a way of granting a higher status to religious beliefs, but it's a way of challenging the idea that public reason would imply translation to the point of of rephrasing religious claims in a broader claim of human interest, whether it be freedom or liberty or integrity. So that is where I think Cécile and I differ. Would comparisons between groups for egalitarian purposes still be helpful? I agree, I think for sure. And I agree entirely with Lucy and take on board all her suggestions. What I would challenge is when equality considerations become exclusive, and instead of feeding into the proportionality test, close down the debate, because then they would actually, and we saw it in Ashbita, they would actually undermine the importance of pluralism. It's not, we saw in Ashbita, the issue is not only whether the neutrality policy was applied consistently, it's the fact that this neutrality rule would actually muffle religious voices. And I think that, of course, we can tackle this through an egalitarian perspective as well, but insisting on the importance of pluralism makes sure that the equality perspective will allow the contribution of religious voices as well as others. Otherwise, it could go towards an equality which neutralizes any expression. The other problem in having a purely equality perspective, and neither Cécile, of course, or Lucy follows that trend, is if we stick to the comparator group conundrum, then it will be very difficult to select and define the right comparator group. And a striking example of this difficulty comes from the US Supreme Court in Tandon, which last April held that because in-house religious gatherings should be exempt from COVID restrictions on in-house gatherings, they should be exempt, from a COVID restriction on in-house gatherings, because various businesses didn't have to abide by those same restrictions. And well, I think the choice of comparator group there, any business is open to challenge. And there is, and I would concur to an extent, but only to an extent, with Chris McCrodden there. There is perhaps a dignity angle to equality in my interpretation. There is perhaps deep down a question of legitimacy. It's not really because my fellow non-religious citizens is allowed to speak that I should be allowed to have a voice. It's not because my male colleague is able to raise his hand that I should be entitled to do the same. We should all, in our different ways, be allowed to contribute, because we are all equal and free citizens. And this idea is, to an extent, of course, captured by the concept of dignity. But I think it is important to still link it within a democratic framework. And this point about the importance of democratic framework leads me to Oliver Gerstenberg's presentation, and there I will draw upon his arguments to reinforce my own thoughts and justify the importance of the principle of revision, and emphasize that it is not about prescribing specific outcomes, but rather about adopting this attitude open to reciprocity and to revision. However, isn't there a risk that this openness towards revision, when it's carried out via a proportionality test by supranational courts, interferes with national assessment? And that's sort of Ronan McRae's question. I think a margin of appreciation is legitimate. It's legitimate out of respect for context, and because but I think that there should be a distinction between how deference and complete carte blanche. And I'm not so sure that the decision in Ashbita was a modest and was a way of stepping back and letting national courts decide. I think what the effect of the Ashbita ruling is really to give the employer a complete carte blanche. The effect is to confer a presumption of legitimacy on employers deciding to enforce company neutrality policies. And I don't see that as being deferential towards laicity. It actually intervenes into national heated debates on the ground about laicity and takes sides in favor of those voices. And there are many in France who would like laicity or its values to extend beyond the state sector. So it's very much interventionist. It's not about stepping back. And also it gives the upper hand to the employer. And I don't see any rationales for it. I mean, I'm happy to return to the questions. A few rationales have been offered, but none of which are completely convincing in my view. It's not about, my approach is not about returning to a pure notion of laicity. And I join Julian Rivers here about English establishment. I think when we look into history, it's not necessarily to identify the root, the pure roots to which we'd like to return. The point is, and Julian did it very well about the English model, and I tried to do the same as well for the French. The aim is to look into the social historical context in order to find elements for an inclusive form of secularism. I am quite aware that this form of inclusive secularism has never fully materialized, but I'm trying to say that it is possible to anchor it into history in both countries, but in ways that are different to each context, of course. And it's quite paradoxical, of course, that sometimes you try to protect values, Republican values in France, or fundamental British values in the UK, the more distant you become from those values. Indeed, there's a paradox. And again, this goes back to Oliver's point about the importance of revision and being open to revisiting legal solutions. Am I willing to go back to my former life as a private international lawyer? What about legal pluralism? I think, yes, of course, in the French context, there is probably a history or a legacy of laicity, which which has led to an aversion for legal pluralism. But in my own democratic approach, legal pluralism, in the sense that we would have different norms, would be welcome as long as it's construed in ways that reinforce the need for legal reasoning to be open to inclusivity, and as long as there's still the possibility for borrowing between norms. If legal pluralism were to be construed as entirely separate spheres evolving completely separately from one another, then it would not be compatible with my democratic approach, because then we would just ossify legal solutions at different levels, and we wouldn't have the principle of revision enforced anymore. have I answered everyone? I'm not sure. How long do I have left?
You have, we're around the end now, but we don't have a massive queue of questions yet. So if you want to keep going, yes, or I can put a question to you as you prefer. It's your party.
Well, maybe then. Well, I could sort of open up a few avenues. First, in terms of a principle of revision, following up from Oliver's point, I would say that, of course, courts, and that's, no, I need to respond a bit more to Malcolm, maybe. And so Malcolm's comments were maybe skeptical about the court's positive contribution to the principle of revision and their ability to make sure that the coexistence or the negative toleration or religious freedom as negative liberties move to a more tolerant cohabitation or vivre ensemble, as I phrased it. And that's precisely why I put forward the democratic approach, in the hope that courts would be more have more tools in order to reach this third stage. I think it is important not to give up on courts, because I think courts offer a valuable forum for competing interests to engage with one another. And that's also a response there to Chris McCrodden. Brexit is one of the reasons which prompted me to write this book, in order to see democracy in a more successful way. I think if we have a principle of proportionality that is balanced and itself inclusive and deliberative, then the individuality, the personality could be reinstated into legal reasoning. But that supposes that the principle of proportionality is not merely a procedural requirement for courts to tick the various interests at stake, but is itself inclusive. And there may be we could quote the Court of Justice ruling last September in the ritual slaughter case. I would say that the Court of Justice in that case probably did not, in my view, carry out the proportionality test in a sufficiently inclusive way, but that the Advocate General Hogan, in his opinion, offered a reasoning which was much more in line with those principles. Happy to return to the case later.
So we have two questions for you, if you would like.
Yes.
The first is from Dr. Surendra Kumar, who asks about the restriction of religious worship during the pandemic, and he was with how that the issue of stopping religious worship and services for a long time fits in with the analysis of your book. And the second is from Fred Wellish, who notes that Winifred Sullivan, in her book, The Impossibility of Religious Freedom, notes that in the US, religious practice has become so individualized and so unmoored from traditional confessional ritual and doctrine that claims of accommodating religious freedom from laws of general applicability should be assessed as the same basis as other non-religious claims. And he wonders whether this approach has any value in the European context, which I think is a great question, given how many of the claim cases that come to European courts focus on Islam and the wearing of religious symbols, and so how key the question of whether there's a degree of collective disadvantages involved in those prohibitions is. So if you'd like to address either of those.
Okay, so so the first question was to what extent religious freedom has been affected by COVID restrictions. Well, I think that like any gatherings, religious gatherings have been impacted by COVID restrictions. But it's fair to say that the courts have probably been quite cautious about upholding restrictions to religious gatherings, and probably perhaps too cautious. I mentioned the US Supreme Court earlier, and I think that thereby equating religious in-house gatherings to any types of business, maybe the court actually trivialized religion directly by protecting religious gatherings too generously, and sort of missed out on the underlying legitimacy of the restriction. But I would say that under my democratic approach, I would not restrict the relationships of religious freedom and COVID to these tensions between religious gatherings and healthcare rules. I think that under my democratic approach, I would try to consider other questions, for example, how religious communities and religious voices might have influenced government decisions. Perhaps at the very beginning, when there were talks of herd immunity, a reaction about vulnerability of the elderly helped counter this trend. And vice versa, it would be interesting to see how government policies influence theology even, or religious practice, where certain rituals were adjusted to restrictions. And maybe also there's an issue of religiosity. Has COVID restrictions created its own ritual, clapping, etc., or has it increased degrees of religiosity? So the second question was, remind me, sorry.
That Winifred Sullivan's point that the individualization of religious practice in America is such that it's inappropriate to really treat religious claims differently from any other individualized kind of spiritual or political claim, and whether that has an equal approach to Europe, to affair matters of religious freedom in Europe. That where religion becomes so individualized, it no longer makes sense to distinguish it from other forms of kind of belief, I think is the line.
So I would agree, I take a subjective test, which is the one adopted by the European Court of Human Rights to define what is religious. But I don't go it doesn't take me to the conclusion that for that reason, it's not necessary to call it religious anymore. I think that there we go back to Cecile's point, because this phrasing as religious will matter for the individual. But to go back to Malcolm's point, I think that it also matters for democracy, and it might be important to underline that it matters for democracy, because otherwise there is a stronger risk that religious freedoms are only construed as negative liberties and not as positive rights of participation. And it's also a way of justifying why they come with limits attached. But on the answer of religion, my approach is not about protecting religion as such. So it has an individual focus, but I keep the category of religious freedom, and I still think that it is important to label it as religious.
Okay, I have two more. One is from Helena Albrecht, who says, asked about the distinction between religious doctrine, which is debated within faith communities, and individual religious freedom. And I would be interested to hear more about your argument in relation to laws such as when we look at Lucy Vicker's distinction between orthodoxy and religions that place more of an emphasis on embodied practices. So if you take an individualistic approach, how do we ensure greater protection for instance, the right to wear a headscarf, based on the fact that it is linked to religious doctrine, not all of where not all believers agree with that doctrine? And the second question is, I'll abuse my position to say in relation to Achbita and Bunawi, and to say, whether the Court of Justice has said that the approach in Belgium, allowing an employer to restrict employees in this way, is mandatory for the whole EU, that would be a problem. But if you understand the court as saying this, the Belgian approach is correct, is permissible under the directive, but that does not prevent other states from reconciling the different rights and interests in a different way, would that be more acceptable? Because it did, in some ways, I think the court fulfill your democratic view by intervening to say you cannot have these laws, rules that target the symbols of one faith, but beyond that we won't prescribe. If the UK or Ireland or Spain can have a different approach, they don't have to permit employers to do this, but it is one of the legitimate ways of regulating our way of living together, is to say, in some contexts, we all have to hold back.
Okay, well, on the first question, this will give me the possibility to go back to your various options, Cécile, and say that I prefer number 3, the third option. It doesn't mean that I would get rid of discrimination law, but I think that even in a discrimination law context, religious freedom is important, and I would actually challenge the very strict division that is sometimes adopted between a religious discrimination and a religious freedom reasoning. And this, I think, would reinforce the right of applicants to wear a headscarf, or more in a more problematic setting, the right of Miss Iwida to wear a cross, because there we were under discrimination law. Her case had failed because as a Christian, she couldn't prove that she wasn't just suffering an individual burden, but that she was the victim of a systemic disadvantage. Her request to wear a cross was considered by English courts to be a mere personal wish. So her claim failed on the discrimination law. It succeeded later on a religious freedom basis. So under my approach, I would have granted her request under discrimination law as well. I think, so for me, religious freedom and the importance of pluralism would be the overarching framework that would influence the way we construe both religious discrimination and religious freedom. It doesn't mean that I negate egalitarian perspectives, but I don't want egalitarian perspectives to be exclusive. And I think the emphasis on vulnerable group is problematic, because it's very hard to say that Miss Iwida wasn't vulnerable. And it's more fundamentally, I think Feynman's work has shown that this division between vulnerability and non-vulnerability suggests that some of us are not vulnerable, and I think it's probably too crude. I agree with you, Ronan, that of course, it's a minimalist protection. So it's possible, minimalist requirements. So it's possible for states to go beyond that threshold. And I think the UK straight away said, oh, we wouldn't limit religious rights in that way. But it's always difficult in the context of religious interests to say what this minimum threshold is, because it's often the protection of one right will be at the expense of another. So it's all quite ambiguous. But what strikes me is that, and Advocate General Sharpston made the point later on, is that it's quite unilateral. I mean, the directive seeks to promote an inclusive workplace. And of course, this directive itself has to be construed in light of, well, I would say, maybe not, of course, but I think it has to be construed in light of fundamental principles in the Charter. And it seems to me that in Ashbita, the directive is construed only in light of Article 16, the right of the employer to conduct a business, but not in light of the other very important principle also in the Charter, Article 10, and the right of non-discrimination. So it seemed to me a bit unbalanced. And that's why I'm still not persuaded that it is actually a neutral minimum threshold.
Great. I think with 3 minutes to go, we have set academic timekeeping records. I think Julian Rivers hinted to me that the reason we were 1 minute over was me, after all my timekeeping virtue signaling. So apologies for that. But thank you to everybody, all 8 speakers, and 7 and me. And but above all, thank you to Miriam, who, as I said, writing a book is a terribly lonely process. And sitting, looking at the ceiling, wondering, will anyone read it? Will it be any good? Am I getting it all wrong? And you've produced in the end a wonderful book that has stimulated us all. And in a field where so many great people have been writing great things, you've managed to say something original and to make a real contribution. So thank you, Miriam, for that. And thank you all for coming. And I invite you to join us for the social event, the link for which has been placed in the chat. So thank you again, and especially thank you and congratulations to Miriam.
Thank you so much. Thank you.